Welcome, students and fellow learners. Today we're going to continue in Mr. American's Moments in Geography with South America. And in particular, we're going to start looking at the Andean countries, or the countries that follow the Andes Mountains. And in particular, today we're going to focus on Colombia. So for our learning target today, we're going to identify, we're going to describe, we're going to get into the people, the physical landscape, certainly that government, and then the economy of Colombia. We're going to document both the resources there as well as the economic challenges, and of course the diverse people that make up Colombia. So I want to start out with kind of talking a little bit about where my resources come from. This is by no means meant to be a very thorough investigation into the history and the people of Colombia. It's meant to be an introduction for my students and also for people who just want to start to get their feet wet, so to speak, into what makes up Colombia. So students, those of you who are following along with your textbook, there's a really cool picture on page 254 in your book, and the book that we use is in the lower right-hand corner for those of you who are interested. And it documents the sometimes relatively unknown part of the economy of Colombia, which is their emerald mining, which is the largest in the world. The two next largest nations that are in emerald mining would include Zambia and then Brazil. So kind of a relatively unknown part of the economy, and we'll come back to that in a moment. All right, let's get into the physical landscape first. So let's situate ourselves. Let's start with size. So for my U.S. listeners and for my students in the U.S., when you think about the size of Colombia, you're talking about roughly 3 times the size of Montana. So it's a fairly large nation when it comes to overall size. It borders with the Caribbean Sea as well as the Pacific Ocean, and it's often referred to as the gateway to South America because of its location and its proximity, of course, to Central America. It's also the site where the Andes become a cordillera. And a cordillera is where 2 mountain ranges run side by side. So let me show you an example of what I mean here. So you can see here on the map that we start to see those 2 ranges run side by side, which is why we see that tend to appear to get wider. And then we're going to see that follow along through other Andean nations in South America. Continuing the landscape, so we also know that human-environment interaction is a really big part of geography. And the highland plateaus and the valleys, with the great changes in elevation that occur in Colombia, this is where the majority of people live, and it's for a couple of reasons. It's temperature-wise and climate-wise, it's preferred compared to the other tropical lowlands, but certainly it's also where agriculture is very viable. And so certainly that's going to be a big drive in where people live. We mentioned that tropical climate, and you do have native populations that still live in these parts of Colombia, but you don't see as large in numbers as you do, say, in the plateaus. And Bogota, which would be our largest and our capital city in Colombia, is actually pretty comfortable. It sits a little bit higher in elevation, but on the Andean plain averages about 67 degrees. And today, which is January 26th, 2020, the temperature was around 65 degrees, which if you're in Minnesota right now, doesn't sound too bad. And Bogota, certainly being the largest city in the nation's capital, it's a very important economic and political center for the country of Colombia. All right, I am going to pause for a moment. I want to show you guys an example here of the economics. And so we've got a comparison here between Venezuela and Colombia. And now we've talked about with Venezuela already in class how that they really focused in on the production of oil. And you can see that in the breakdown here and how it makes up such a large part of their economy. Now, Colombia does have a fair reliance on fossil fuels, in particular oil and coal, which we'll get to here in just a second. But you can also see that they differ a little bit more in the other resources. And that's kind of where we're going to get to dive a little bit deeper today. So what are those major resources? Coal and oil. But we're also going to talk about, too, the other portions that make it up. the economy. So we talked about coal and oil. Those are both very important. Coal is going to be found in the more mountainous areas around the Andes, and then the lowlands are where you're going to find most of your oil. And certainly a nation like Venezuela has larger amounts of reserves of oil, but it's still an important part of Colombia's economy. When it comes to potential, the only nation in South America that has a greater potential for hydroelectric power is Brazil. And so this could be something that Colombia uses more in the future in order to meet energy needs. All right, we talked about those emeralds earlier in our lecture here, but we can certainly add another precious metal, and that would be gold here. That also is an important part of the economy, particularly, again, in your more mountainous areas of Colombia. Clothing, leather goods, chemical, iron and steel, as well as food production. Colombian coffee is very well known around the world. Bananas, sugarcane, no surprise there, again, given the history of South America. Certainly rice, cotton, and cacao, which we'll talk about a little bit later. You might be surprised, though, that the floral industry accounts for about $1 billion worth of exports in Colombia, and certainly becoming an important part of that economy. Now, the economic challenges for Colombia are very well documented. They've been popularized in film and in Netflix series, but certainly that connection with the illegal drug trade is something that is a very documented part of Colombia's past. And the drug that in particular that is grown in Colombia is cocaine. Now, the cacao plant, when it's dried and then formed into a powder and mixed, of course, with other chemicals, it becomes cocaine. And somewhere around 70% of the cocaine that has been in places like the U.S., particularly in the Western Hemisphere, along with Canada, comes from Colombia. And so drug lords, as well as that other issues that come with drug trafficking, like human trafficking and the illegal slave trade, those are certainly other things that have connected with those challenges, but certainly fighting that corruption and fighting that power have also led to challenges for Colombia. All right, let's dive a little bit now into the history and the people of Colombia. So the population and the numbers that I could find, the most recent numbers I could find, and this is based on January 2020, is around 50.65 million. So it's a fairly well-populated nation, and it certainly is a part of the world that is growing. The culture of Colombia is quite diverse. We're going to get into that a little bit later here, but you can see influence from native populations. You can see influences from the Spanish as well as African populations that have made their way and created a unique culture, which again we'll dive into more a little bit later. But most Colombians find themselves as mestizos, and these are a mix of European and Native American backgrounds. And Colombia became one of the first nations in South America to declare its independence, and under the leadership of several people, including Simón Bolívar, they led to a struggle for independence. And at first, they were a part of what eventually would become a few different independent nations, working kind of together as one new nation and eventually separating. Today, Colombia is a republic with an elected president, and Iván Duque Marquez, as of August 2018, is the president of Colombia. Continuing with that history, the history of Colombia is a violent one. It accounts for 8 civil wars and, of course, more than 50 revolts against the government and other political figures. Those political groups, such as the FARC, continue to be a major challenge for the government of Colombia as well as the people of Colombia. These are rebels who have been fighting against the government, and they've pushed several farmers out of urban areas, which in some cases has also opened up opportunities for drug lords to use that land in order to continue their own businesses. And several resources, but among them the Long March to Freedom, is a resource that really does help to document how this group works and how they operate, as well as the motion picture based on that book titled Proof of Life. All right, let's dive into the people as we kind of wrap up here. So the people of Colombia, again, have experienced a very rapid urbanization, and a big part of that is those political groups that have pushed people out of, and especially farmers like your campesinos, which have moved their families to urban areas. We have 30 cities now in Colombia that have a population of 100,000 or greater. Now, for my students, and maybe perhaps some fellow U.S. listeners, I'm coming to you from Minnesota, actually Rochester, Minnesota, and there are 3 cities in Minnesota that have a population of 100,000 or greater. The first one is Minneapolis, the second one is St. Paul, and then the third one is Rochester. And so certainly we can see that when comparing it to what we know best as Minnesotans, we can see that we don't have the urbanization, say, that a nation like Colombia does. Now, we can see that mix of the importance of native populations through things like ancient basket weaving, as well as other traditions. We can see the African rhythms that have connected with Spanish music, and we can see that those have all melded into this cool, diverse culture that is Colombia. And we can see that contribution into things like sports in the United States. And some examples include Orlando Cabrera, as well as Juan Pablo Montoya in their respective sports. All right, as always, students, I hope you found this helpful. Check out this quick check-in quiz just to make sure that you're kind of getting some of the major highlights from this. Use this to help you with your learning activities in class. And for those of you who are listening just for fun, thank you for tuning in. It's much appreciated. The goal here is just to give you an introduction into the really fascinating culture that is Colombia. So thank you for checking this video out, and I hope you found it helpful, and have a great day. Thank you.